scratchy voice. I'm just recovering from being sick for the past week, but hopefully we'll proceed without any further ado. Okay, so now um, I'm I'm there's a bit of a lag with the button. Okay, so I'm talking about a very specific aspect of trauma-informed teaching. I really want to just introduce to you the idea of what are normally bigger workshops that I give that you can, if you ever want them for your staff or department or any reason, you can just contact me. I do them quite regularly, but I wanted to pull out of the what are usually 2 hour workshops a couple of key themes that have been very much on my mind lately and have been worrying me a little bit. So I'm going to start with a quote from a book by Judith Herman called Trauma and Recovery, from Domestic Violence to Political Terror. Herman is really one of the people who was instrumental in the current wave of kind of trauma-informed thinking and trauma-informed professional practice, really through this book. And her analysis is interesting because she's also part of a move away from a psychologization of trauma and a relegating of the idea of trauma to kind of psychotherapeutics, and instead to look at it as something that is both psychological and social. Okay, so in this quote, she says, the ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. I want you to pay attention to the wording of that first sentence. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Atrocities, however, refuse to be buried. As powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial does not work. Folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. Murder will out. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and for the healing of individual victims. And I want you to contrast the opening sentence and the closing sentence. The ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them, and remembering and telling the truth are prerequisites for the restoration of both the social order and the healing of individuals. Okay, so um, I have. I've lost my ability. Oh, there it is, there to move the slide. Okay, good. There we go. Okay, so as I was saying, this is an extract from a workshop. It's not a kind of complete workshop. And I'm just trying to identify not so much what we do in these trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed pedagogy workshops, but 2 emerging risks that I've been kind of horrified by, that I think kind of threaten the whole project of trauma-informed pedagogy. And I want to just use this opportunity to share some key concepts with you, some of which I've kind of just made up in the last few months, and I'm seeing whether they are meaningful for people. So the 2 risks that I think are as the trauma-informed field becomes a big field, there's 2 things going wrong. That one is a fundamental misunderstanding of what trauma is, and the other is a totally uncritical application of the idea of trauma-informed practice. And in the face of that, what I'm advancing is the notion of asymmetrical validation, which I'll explain later, the notion of repressive inclusion, which I'll talk about later, and then the core concept of this talk, transformative discomfort, and quite a traditional psychological concept, which I'm bringing in to help with this analysis, the idea of the window of tolerance. So the context here is, for more than 20 years, I've been working on trauma-informed professional practice and trauma-informed pedagogy at the intersection of psychology and social justice. So my work, my intellectual work, is the development of curriculum and teaching practice around social justice studies, which traditionally doesn't exist as a field. So it's the creation of the field of social justice studies. But I also have a background in psychology. And for these past 20 years, I've been teaching different iterations of a subject, which most recently has been this honors course LST4 VST, working with victims and survivors. But what's happened recently is that trauma-informed practice has become a kind of a corporate buzzword and marketing slogan. And it's happened because of a fundamental structural change that has happened in universities in the last few decades, which is the universities have been kind of sucked into a neoliberal managerialism on the one hand, and a kind of Californian style self-help kind of cultural populism on the other hand, and have moved away from being public resources, public educational resources for the good of society. That seems to have collapsed, and now they're really now just managed brands, and this has completely undermined the ethical and social justice basis of trauma-informed practice. So what's going on at the moment is what's being sold as trauma-informed practice is really a form of corporate risk management and a form of brand promotion. So it doesn't really have to do with the support of vulnerable people. It has to do with reputation management primarily. And this is catastrophic. This is really, in my mind, the death of trauma-informed practice. The other thing that's really interesting, it's been adopted by kind of alt-right politics and a culture war. So the language of victimization, the language of the way in which vulnerable groups are harmed, the way in which, sort of women, queer people, ethnic minorities are harmed by the power structures in society, has been precisely co-opted by the people who are in positions of privilege. So it's now the domain of kind of, white middle class people, men who feel like feminism is undermining them. And so we see this emergent politics that is based on a kind of a misappropriation of a victim discourse. And that's also part of this cultural nexus that threatens trauma-informed practice. And so what happens now is trauma-informed practice is being mobilized against social critique, against kind of progressive social intervention, and against social equality. Um, so, what is trauma-informed practice? And at its absolute basics, it seems to be about two different ideas. That people have negative reactions to experiences. That's it. It's as simple as that. And secondly, the ethical principle that we should avoid doing harm. And when you take those two together, that necessitates taking seriously the idea of trauma-informed practice. Um, and there's a number of ways that this can be done. Okay, firstly, and this is the most simple and superficial way, is by helping people to avoid unnecessary exposure to distressing experiences. So that's the first thing. Well, don't do anything, say anything, read anything that might be distressing. Okay, the second and deeper level is providing support for those experiences and saying, well, if people are having those experiences, they need to be scaffolded, they need to be supported through those experiences. The third, and then we get into the real important stuff, is offering skills and training to become better at managing those experiences. So now we've moved quite far away from saying, oh, we must just avoid the experiences. We're now saying we must actually be good at having those experiences. And then also providing models of collective supportive trauma-informed practice, like organizational practice. And you can see that there's a real kind of conceptual shift between the different points offered there. Um, but a really important conceptual distinction needs to be made here, which in the sense of the kind of common difference between discomfort and trauma. So discomfort or distress is something that doesn't feel nice, but trauma is something that is harmful, and those are not the same thing. And the main difference is that if something doesn't make us feel nice, when that thing goes away, we end up feeling better. There's an automatic process of recovery. Whereas trauma leaves an impact, and it leaves a lasting negative impact, which requires support and intervention. Um, so what's interesting, though, is what we tend to see both distress and trauma as completely negative. And in fact, they can have both negative and positive effects. but trauma risks leaving these kind of ongoing negative effects that are difficult to change or escape from. Um, and so, on the one hand, we can see that distress can function in a number of ways. For instance, it can motivate us to solve a problem, or it can motivate us to avoid a problem. So, for instance, a student finding material distressing can just decide, oh, well, I'm not reading that, I'm not studying that, I'm not going to class. Or they can relate to it in the sense of like, oh, this, my feelings about this indicate a fundamental underlying social problem, which I feel highly motivated to develop expertise in and resolve so that that problem no longer exists. And that avoidance versus engagement is one of the deep things I want to talk about in trauma-informed practice. Okay, so as I've said, unlike stress, we don't automatically recover from trauma, and trauma then can continue to exist in like chronic anxiety, panic attacks, flashbacks, depression, withdrawal, dissociation, helplessness, destructive behavior, dysregulated emotions, and even interestingly, in chronic physical illness. Okay. So that's a very, very serious set of problems to be managing. In these, but in that state, the kind of the techniques that are conventionally used to manage minor discomfort may not only be unhelpful, they may actually be harmful. So a lot of the sort of simple kind of the cultural cliches about helping people are in a state of distress. Giving them advice, telling them to avoid the things, rolling out these kind of like, quasi new age platitudes, and even cognitive behavioral psychotherapies can actually be harmful to people who are suffering trauma rather than everyday distress. One of the interesting things about trauma is that one of the things that is known about it is, in addition to the negative impacts, it can have this really interesting possibility of post-traumatic growth. So, having experienced psychological trauma can actually lead to deeper insight, deeper empathy for other people suffering, more understanding, compassion. But this only happens under certain conditions. So whether it goes in a purely negative direction or whether it goes in a transformative direction and even leads to positive outcomes depends on supportive interventions, which are really at the heart of what our trauma-informed practice is about. So to do this trauma-informed practice, we need to understand how distress and trauma work. Okay, and we need to understand them not just as like, oh, this is something bad to avoid. We need to understand the underlying processes. And this is really a lot of what happens in the workshops, but also what happens on a very deep level in the subject that I offer on trauma-informed practice. Okay. And so the goal there is not only about limiting harm, it's also about enhancing positive transformation. And this is really the single point that I want to make, that trauma-informed practice is about supporting positive transformation, just not about harm reduction. It's about both of those things working together in an interactive way. So what is not a proper trauma-informed practice, but it's being called trauma-informed practice at the moment. Okay, as I pointed out, these kind of corporate risk avoidance strategies for preventing people having challenging experience. So what we see here, for instance, in the US, we see the banning of critical race theory, we see the banning of gender studies in schools and universities to say, oh no, but like middle class white Americans are having funny feelings in their tummy when they find out about structural racial privilege or patriarchy. So we really mustn't allow that to happen at university anymore. And that co-optation of trauma-informed practice is exactly what I'm waging a war to the death against. I think that is the worst possible misappropriation of this field. Okay. So what's going on there is that this desire for people not to ever feel uncomfortable is being used by those in power to prevent structural challenges to social privilege. And this seems to me exactly what certainly people like me in the humanities and social sciences, it's the exact opposite of what we should be doing pedagogically. So let's give an example. And this is interesting because this is not out of humanities and social sciences. This is out of proper real science, the stuff that me and my colleagues are incomprehending about. Okay, so climate science. So when you teach climate science, you're teaching hard science, you're teaching data sets, you're teaching analytic concepts, you're teaching scientific theories. But what's going on there is also you're shaping an understanding of a problem and you're making people aware of historical situations and scenarios. So you're not just it's not just abstract scientific information. It's also shaping an interpretation of a world, and that is a distressing world. Okay, so on a psychological level, what's happening in the teaching of this pure science is a growing understanding of future catastrophe, inevitable future catastrophe, perhaps, that it can be extremely triggering, can cause anxiety, despair, helplessness, rage. Okay, so even this pure science can have a deep, deep psychological resonance. That can go in a number of directions. It can either go in a like, well, we really need to commit to solving this problem with a deep emotional investment in it, or just a sense of that's too horrifying. I need to never think about that again. Or I need to adopt a denialist view about it and engage in anti-science to make those bad feelings go away. And we know, for instance, that the that there's a specific identified form of PTSD that sorry, I don't know why I've moved the slides. Associated with climate science. Okay, and the problem is that people in the hard sciences are typically not taught that one of the things you might have to do when you're teaching science is understand emotions and understand the kind of psychological reactions that you and your students might have. That's often antithetical to the assumed epistemology of science, whereas much more familiar to us. So the three alternatives that people might have in reaction to that is to have a non-trauma informed reaction, which is this to say we're going to ignore these psychological impacts. If people feel freaked out, they're just bad scientists, they're unprofessional, they're weak, and dismiss the whole problem. Or you can have a badly trauma-informed practice, which is to say, well, we identify and acknowledge those negative psychological reactions. And what we must do is stop teaching this field. We must stop teaching climate science. It might be too distressing to our educational clients. Um, and so just leave it out and let the world go to hell without this essential scientific knowledge that we need to do something about it. Or we can have a trauma-informed approach, which is to say we need to rethink how we're doing it. We need to teach climate science with the recognition of its impacts, with strategies of managing those impacts, with specific strategies for turning distress into positive transformative engagement. Okay. And then to contrast that with one of the most obvious examples from the social sciences, which we work on, is sexual violence. Now, everyone would expect, well, this is a risky topic. This will trigger traumatic memories for some people. Once again, that leads to different forms of engagement. The one is to say, well, we shouldn't cover it. And the other is to say, well, cover it in a purely theoretical way. Don't get engaged with the emotional parts. Don't look at case studies that are confronting. Don't engage with the emotional impacts on students. And that's once again, that's the bad trauma-informed approach versus a good trauma-informed approach is to engage with both the structural which is the more social conceptual understanding of sexual violence and what we need to do about it, but also with the emotional aspects, why it is such a triggering topic, and why knowing that it's a triggering topic actually makes people better at working in this field. Getting students to acknowledge that they have emotional reactions to it, understand those emotional reactions, giving them skills at getting better at dealing with those emotional reactions That is what actually makes them good at then doing that work, going into work where they are working with vulnerable people, survivors of sexual violence, institutional programs for reducing sexual violence. That becoming good at those feelings is the core professional skill combined with the intellectual skill of understanding the structural processes that form that problem. And that is the good kind of trauma-informed pathway. Okay, so this is where I want to introduce this kind of idea that I'm testing out at the moment, idea of transformative discomfort, against the idea that our job is to make sure people never feel bad. I want to argue that our job is to make sure that people's bad feelings turn into something positive, and that's the transformative part of the discomfort. Discomfort is useful if it leads to insight and understanding, if it leads to a deeper understanding of oneself, a deeper empathy for others, a deeper understanding of the impacts of the social world on vulnerable people. And this can, in fact, increase motivation to engage and resolve these issues. And most of all, it can increase our capacity to engage with them. Because what we see is a lot of people in fields like this, in like gender violence fields, a lot of people are passionate, they study it, they go out and work in the field, and they burn out within 3 to 5 years. And so there's a catastrophic turnover of people working in these vulnerable fields. Okay. And the way in which we do this, and this is where I'm introducing the traditional psychological notion of window of tolerance out of trauma studies. The window of tolerance is the good space in between one negative extreme and the other negative extreme. The one negative extreme, which very common when we are affected badly by something, and this is the first sentence in the Herman's quote, is that the first reaction to trauma is to avoid it. So people try to avoid stuff, disengage, dissociate, all of those avoidance reactions. So we want to move away from that avoidance reaction, but we don't want to go to being overwhelmed because that's the PTSD state. So in between avoidance and being overwhelmed is this good space, is this space of positive engagement, and so the work becomes to widen the window of tolerance, to provide the support structures and skills to open that window of tolerance rather than keeping it a very narrow, out of control space. And that's what we do in the workshops. So okay, so what does this look like in practice? People always want practical interventions. I always don't want to give them practical interventions because I think that short circuits a real process-oriented engagement. But I'll give you the practical interventions just to help us get to the processes. Okay, so firstly, we must thoughtfully plan curriculum with an understanding that there are different aspects, and this is the important thing, different things will impact on different students in different ways. Like some people will be totally okay, and some people will be absolutely not okay with exactly the same thing. And we need to have an anticipatory mapping of that and understand why and understand how we're going to deal with it. So we have obvious things like we have trigger warnings, content notification, opt-out alternatives, and I can talk to you in another forum about how best to structure those. But really, this is guided by our ethical notion of informed consent. Students must be giving the informed consent to be exposed to things. And this must be supported not just in the teaching content, but in the forms of assessment, okay? Because you can't put students under duress at critical assessment times. That also means we have to have external support services, which we have to some extent within the university, but also there needs to be internal support processes in the subjects themselves. And this is really also what I focus on in the workshop. What are those internal things you can be doing in your subjects, which I identify very briefly as foregrounding, explaining, and normalizing negative and traumatic reactions. And we don't have time to really explain what that looks like in practice.
And could I interrupt? You have
Yeah.
4 minutes left.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. But the strategies kind of look like that. Firstly, explain to people what their reactions might be. Give them an intellectually coherent framework so that their feelings are something that makes intellectual sense. Because we're very bad at doing that. We give people analytic ideas, but we don't make the bridge between like the analytic ideas and the gut reactions they have. So we've got to bridge those two realms of the educational experience. And it's very easy to do that. Secondly, we model those processes in teaching practice. We model vulnerability. We talk about, like, one of the first things, I remember the first time I ever started crying in a lecture, and I really freaked out because I'd been taught to believe that that was terribly unprofessional. And then I realized that that was a key transformative moment that changed the whole course and made the whole course more effective because the students suddenly could see that the kind of feelings that they were having to some in response to some of our case studies were actually very ordinary human reactions that and they didn't feel shame, they didn't feel socially excluded by that. And obviously, I'm not saying like, go in and weep for 5 minutes, on command. It's not that at all. But engage as an actual living human being without this kind of faux atmosphere of repressive professionalism that forces people to dissociate their humanity from the content that they're trying to teach. And then specifically use that in a critically reflective, intellectually structured way to help the students identify and understand these experiences in themselves. And in doing that in the classroom, you create a trauma-informed community of practice. What happens is this total social dynamic change in the classroom where people start acknowledging first theirs and then everyone else's vulnerability. And they start modeling social support, respect, engagement as ordinary interpersonal skills. And then you reflexively highlight those and show them what they're doing and how to do that better and how to then embody that in professional contexts. So this becomes about teaching and implementing multiple kind of both self-care, but also much more importantly, collective care practices that people can use in professional contexts. Okay, so
1 minute,
um,
Anthony.
is that it?
1 minute. Keep going.
Okay, great. I've got about 1.5 minutes, I think, to go. Okay, so the corporate risk management goal of avoiding distress that I'm really just hating on today and want to stop forever as an incredibly harmful and destructive practice because it actively harms those who are affected by silencing and excluding those. And one of the things we know from trauma studies is it's precisely not just the traumatic event, but the post-traumatic silencing and exclusion of people who've had terrible experiences that really harms them. And we are organizationally doing exactly that re-traumatization when we have this naive kind of avoidance model of trauma-informed practice. It also then shuts down the core learning opportunity. It prevents students from learning how to manage distressing experiences in themselves and others. It shuts down the possibility of learning to widen that window of tolerance. It prevents them from becoming insightful, skilled, and empathic trauma-informed professionals. And then the single worst thing of all of this is it then can become politically weaponized by elites. It can become the strategy for saying, well, we don't want white men to be learning about gender violence because it makes them feel funny, or we don't want white people to learn about structural racism, or we can't talk about the genocide in Gaza because some of our students may have funny feelings in their tummy. So rather let the genocide happen so that we can protect a few people from having uncomfortable feelings, which is not only radically anti-intellectual, it's radically anti-ethical in a way that I think is an unspeakable catastrophe. So our goals then are to turn discomfort into learning and transformation, to widen the window of tolerance, to replace practices that increase secondary and vicarious trauma, to replace them with strategies of self-care, strategies for caring for other vulnerable people, and strategies for collective social and organizational practice. Okay. And then I conclude, going right back to our first slide. Now look at those first and last sentences again from the Herman quote. They may be more meaningful now. The ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. But her final sentence, and this is the core of a critical trauma-informed practice, remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites for the restoration of the social order and for the healing of individual victims. Thanks.